Flight 804 began as an ordinary run out of Seattle, carrying passengers expecting nothing more than a routine landing in Anchorage. Over the Chugach Mountains, the weather was shifting. Despite the dropping barometric pressure and a severe winter system moving in, Miller remained convinced the flight computers could handle any turbulence the mountains threw at them. In seat 14B, Maya sat quietly in a faded gray hoodie, her fingers tracing a scratched squadron crest on a silver thermos. She was a passenger trying to stay invisible, but she was also someone who had grown up feeling the vibration of an engine through the soles of her shoes. Modern flight relies on the assumption that automated systems will always interpret the environment more accurately than a human. But when those machines encounter conditions they weren't programmed to understand, that total reliance leaves the crew unable to recognize the physical reality of the sky. At 30,000 feet, the ventilation faded to a whistle and the cabin air turned freezing. Then came the shudder, a violent sideways slip that sent the overhead bins groaning as the emergency lights flickered to life. In the cockpit, the situation was collapsing. The captain had suffered a stroke, leaving Miller alone to face a dashboard filled with flashing red error screens and a control column that refused to behave. The plane wasn't just malfunctioning, it was fighting its own sensors. The automated systems were misreading the storm and executing maneuvers that threatened to tear the aircraft apart, requiring a human to step in and shut the computer down. Maya entered the cockpit and immediately correlated the red warnings with the hunting engine thrust she had felt through the floorboards minutes earlier. She looked at the mismatched speed indicators and diagnosed the problem. The sensors were lying. This is a pitot-static system. It uses a forward-facing pitot tube to catch the ram air of the plane's forward motion and compares it to the still air at the static port to calculate speed and altitude. If that tube is frozen shut, the computer receives a zero-pressure reading. It thinks the plane has stopped moving, and in a desperate attempt to gain speed, it will command the engines to full throttle and pitch the nose down. Maya didn't wait for Miller's permission. She reached out and manually disconnected the autothrottle, severing the computer's link to the engines and stopping the plane from pitching into a terminal stall. In a data failure, the only way to save the aircraft is to stop trusting the digital displays and start flying by the physical weight and sound of the machine. Maya took the controls and keyed the radio to Anchorage Center. She bypassed the standard flight number and used a call sign that hadn't been heard in over a decade, Gyrfalcon 2.
The call sign was a legacy from her father, Thomas Vance. Long before she stepped onto a Boeing, she had learned the physics of the air in small float planes, where survival depended on sensing changes in air density through the yoke, rather than reading them on a screen. Saving Flight 804 now required Maya to apply those analog survival skills to a 200-ton jet. She had to become the sensor the plane had lost. As they dropped to 20,000 feet, the hydraulic pressure plummeted. The control wheel, the pilot's only way to move the wings, seized up, stiffening like concrete in Maya's hands. Hydraulics are the muscles of the aircraft. Without that pressure, the pilot is physically disconnected from the rudder and the ailerons. The plane becomes a dead weight, unable to turn or level itself through the yoke. With the primary steering locked, Maya moved her hands to the engine throttles. She was going to steer the entire aircraft using only the asymmetrical force of its propulsion. This is differential thrust. Maya pulled the left engine back to 60% while holding the right at 75%, creating a deliberate imbalance in power. Because the right engine is pushing harder than the left, the aircraft is forced to yaw or pivot to the left. By constantly adjusting these two levers, she could navigate the plane toward the runway without moving a single flight surface on the wings. Mastering a machine under these conditions isn't about memorizing buttons. It's about understanding its raw physics well enough to use the engines as a steering wheel. The final descent was a wrestling match against blinding crosswinds. Maya had to constantly recalculate the engine thrust to keep the heavy jet centered on the approach path as the snow obscured the horizon. The tires slammed onto the icy runway with a jolt that shook the entire cabin. The plane skidded, its nose gear screaming against the ice, before finally coming to a stop at the edge of the tarmac, surrounded by emergency lights. Inside the cockpit, the silence was absolute. Miller sat broken, sobbing into his hands. Maya remained in the pilot's seat, motionless, her fingers still frozen on the cold metal of the throttles.
When the software fails and the mechanical safety nets snap, the outcome depends entirely on a human's ability to interpret the physical protest of the aircraft and react to the pull of the wind. 2 years later, the hangar in Talkeetna was silent under fresh snow. Maya stood among the small planes of her childhood, her father's battered silver thermos sitting on the desk where she now planned her own flights. Arthur often stopped by to watch her work. He told her that Thomas Vance had viewed a pilot's role as a fundamental responsibility to carry the weight of the sky. Technology is a tool that extends our reach, but it cannot replace a foundational understanding of the physical world. Survival in the air, or anywhere else, still requires the courage to take the controls when the machines stop making sense.